Hi, this is Ron Vaillant, your People's Party of Canada candidate for Prince George Peace River Northern Rockies in British Columbia. This is a very important video as it's going to affect all of Canada as we build up the picture of what's happening here. I'm going to lay it out like an investigative reporter. I came into this riding, I wanted to find out what the key issues were, and so I'm going to lay them out as they came to me. First issue I heard was this issue of caribou recovery. The issue of trying to set aside a huge swath of land. It's 420,000 hectares of land. It's over 1 million acres, and some are saying it could be 3 times that amount by the time it's all said and done. In order to recover, a few thousand head of caribou, I believe it is. So what happened here was in April of this year in the various different small towns, this information was rolled out to the people, and I'll show you some videos here later on as it shows you how many people showed up. A lot of places, it'd be 1,000 people. This is a very, very dramatic thing because what's going to happen is people are going to be off limits as to be able to go and do their recreational activities, but more so to be able to actually even work. Forestry, mining, drilling, all sorts of things will be off limits in order to recover these caribou herds. Now, what people are saying is that this huge swath of land, the caribou aren't all over this land. They're in certain segments. They're also, I'm told, are inbred too as well. They don't go and migrate up north where all the caribou really are. Well, people just don't feel that's necessary to have this huge swath of land set aside for these caribou. So they're not very happy about it. So that was in April, and they haven't had any meetings since, actually. But I did go to one meeting here, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit after this. Okay, moving on to another subject here, which is not directly related, is an issue of land treaty entitlements, I believe it's called. And the federal government is going ahead and laying aside, it's almost 1.5 million acres, as I understand it, here in BC to the Aboriginal bands. When they did the original land treaties, they said now that they've miscounted by a certain percentage of each band. For instance, the one we're going to talk about here is a blueberry band over by Fort St. John. There's less than 200 people in that band right now, and I understand that they've miscounted apparently 120 years ago about 100 head there, and they are allotted, I think, about 120 acres per head. Now, I could be off my numbers here, but this is just like a generality thing here. And so, I guess apparently they miscounted all the way across BC, and it wouldn't surprise me actually if this is all the way across Canada. And there is a subdivision that's just north of Fort St. John, Red Creek I believe it's called, where the Blueberry Band is claiming land all around this subdivision. The only access would be the one road coming in. And they're not happy about that at all. They're not being compensated for any kind of property devaluation on account of this. These things have been going on for about 8 years with this subdivision. The people that I've talked to, they say that it wasn't really a very transparent situation, that they're kind of doled out the information piecemeal. And now they have kind of a big picture of what's going on. Earlier this year in January, the chief of the Blueberry Band had stated it was an open house talking about their new land claim that has been settled here. So in this town hall meeting, or this unveiling of their land claim, the chief had mentioned that it was all done in good faith with the stakeholders at hand, but there was one person who had made exception to that and said that basically that they only attended the very first meeting and then they left early and they didn't attend all the other meetings, and this is all kind of a surprise to them that this is all going on. This land here that's being claimed actually is just very close to Fort St. John. It's about 20 minutes out, and there's 20,000 people in Fort St. John. This is where they go and do their recreation. They go quadding and go out into the backcountry there. It's the closest Crown land actually. And you have less than 200 people in the Blueberry Band claiming this land. So it's going to be a great hit to the town for this land to be off limits. Okay, so that's another issue separate from the caribou recovery, but it still is going to be tied in actually in some ways. So up here in Northern BC, there's a partnership agreement between the Government of Canada, the provincial government, the West Moberly and the Saulteaux Aboriginal bands in regards to this caribou recovery and this huge allotment of land. There's no town mayors or councils involved in this partnership agreement at all. And I'd like to read some of that to you here. Okay, it says here that it's the Intergovernmental Partnership Agreement for the Conservation of the Central Group of the Southern Mountain Caribou, February 21st, 2019, between Her Majesty the Queen and Right of Canada and Her Majesty the Queen and Right of the Province of British Columbia, the Saulteaux First Nations, and the West Moberly First Nations. Preamble. So, whereas the woodland caribou, the southern mountain population, is a species which has been listed as threatened under the Federal Species at Risk Act, the SARA they call it. It's under Section 11 apparently. Whereas the Minister of Environment, that would be Catherine Meckenne, and the Climate Change Canada have determined that there is an imminent threat to the recovery of the southern mountain caribou in British Columbia. Now please notice this point here. It says, whereas the parties recognize that the protection of the habitat species at risk is key to their conservation. It's all about protecting the habitat here. It doesn't describe how this affects the caribou. Now when you go and see the vast area, it just goes beyond human comprehension to see how large an area this is. It doesn't address any of the real issues, talking about, for instance, the wolf population that is growing and would kill the calves when they're born. The wolf population is another big issue for farmers. They're losing a lot of their cattle and livestock to these wolves. But it doesn't address even the grizzly bears and doing the same thing. And they have people not allowed to hunt the grizzly bears anymore, and the population is growing. There's so many other issues involved, but the only thing is just this focus on the habitat or the land. So one thing to recognize is there a correlation here in the Agenda 21 video when they talk about this issue of conservation? It's very important that everyone go and watch that video. You can skip the first 2 minutes and 30 seconds of it and get into it. On the bottom of page 2, this is where it gets interesting. It says the British Columbia and Canada are committed to fully adopting and implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Have you heard about this declaration? Has your member of Parliament told you about this declaration? Okay, and the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. We have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Kind of sounds like South Africa, what they went through, including through the review and amendment of policies, programs, and legislation. Going on onto page 3 here under purpose, it says the purpose of the partnership agreement is to set out and confirm the actions that the parties have agreed to take in order to achieve their shared objective of immediately stabilizing and expeditiously growing the population of the central group to levels that are self-sustaining and support traditional Aboriginal harvesting activities, consistent with the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. So now we've got this entirely new thing here. We have the caribou recovery that is being talked about. And actually, before I get into it, I'd like to share that this is not in just BC. I was talking to a logger in Alberta, and he can't go logging certain areas now because of what's going on. All the way down to McBride, what's happening is your signs are being put up where people can't go into the backcountry. Everything's basically on shutdown and hold, really. And then I talked to another People's Party of Canada candidate in Quebec through email, and he's stating that the caribou recovery thing is going on over there as well, and that 9,000 jobs are at stake over there, and it's just going to decimate northern Quebec communities. Same thing up here in BC. These communities are going to be absolutely hammered. They're not going to be able to do any resource development or you know, extracting of the forest or anything up here. So this is very serious. But in this agreement we just read there, that it's actually the UNDRIP agreement is involved in all of this. And that's this bad boy right here. I'd like to read from this actually, because this is very powerful. Now notice that it's the United Nations, right? The United Nations is acting as a world body, and our governments are capitulating to their demands. Now, one thing that you have to note here with the People's Party of Canada, we're going to be looking at all of these agreements and seeing whether we should be having them in Canada. Okay, this is on page 11 of this document. Bearing in mind that nothing in this declaration may be used to deny any peoples their rights to self-determination exercised in conformity with international law. So this whole thing is based on international law, the United Nations law, not the Canadian government law. Okay, same page. Encouraging states to comply with and effectively implement all their obligations as they apply to Indigenous peoples under international instruments. Okay, so you have the authority here of the United Nations over top of Canada. Now this is page 14, Article 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Okay. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4. Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government. Article 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, okay, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. Okay, so here we have a situation here where they can be a nation within a nation, they can govern themselves, set up their own entire political system, and yet still fully participate in another political system of another state. Page 24 states in section, this is Article 21, Section 2, it says the state shall take effective measures and where appropriate special measures to ensure continuing improvement of their economic and social conditions. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. Page 25, this is Article 24. It says Indigenous individuals have the equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. Okay. States shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively and full realization of that right. Okay, this is on page 26. This is Article 25. It says Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Article 26(1) states that Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources for which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. So what does that mean? Can you see a problem with that? What they've otherwise used. Can't they just say that they've used all of it? Okay, so they, with the whole thing with the caribou recovery, there was no meetings up until actually the coal and energy rally, which I attended. And I went and I asked permission in order to be able to record some of the meetings, and I wanted to record the caribou recovery because they were doing a panel on it. And I also got approval by one of the persons that I had gone on a boat ride with, actually, and asked him if it was okay. I didn't know the other people involved, so I didn't really ask because I didn't know them. So there was a panel discussion there, and I had asked my questions, and one of the questions I had asked, because the council had mentioned a court case in which they basically have the rights to be able to have access and hunt and fish on all of the Treaty 8 land, not just basically the reserve land. So I had recorded the event, but now people are saying that they don't want it released. Now I don't understand why, because there wasn't really any kind of groundbreaking information there. But I'm basically kind of held at bay here. I can't release it. I'd like to. Maybe one day it might happen. But this is kind of the problem that people have told me about this whole process. They felt that it was very secretive and kind of sprung on the whole area here. Now I know that I've heard that there are some high officials, and they basically have gag orders. They're not allowed to speak to anyone about this whole issue. And people aren't happy about that. They're just feeling out of loop, out of the process, and they don't like the fact that the agreement is just basically between the governments and the two Aboriginal bands. And another thing that happened actually, which is totally new to me, I've never seen it before, at the Coal and Energy Rally I saw it twice, maybe even 3 times actually. And that is when they start their meeting, they acknowledge that they're on the ancestral lands of various First Nations. And I thought that was, the first time I heard it, I thought it was kind of like, oh, that's interesting, it's kind of like paying respect, I guess you might say. But then it happened the second time, the second day actually. And I was wondering, what's going on here? Why is this acknowledgement going on? And then it happened also in a prayer actually. And the 2 times that there was prayers for the meals that we had, they were done by Aboriginal people. The first time, that's no problem at all, but then I was wondering about the second time, how come they didn't have a Christian actually giving a prayer? It didn't make sense to me. But apparently what's happening is this is going on in almost every kind of public meeting, whether it's in a school or any kind of major meeting that's happening. They always give this acknowledgement. And here I'll show you an example. Now these 2 examples are when they were actually doing the caribou recovery meetings in April. Look at the turnout and also look at how it's done here.
Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started. So please take a seat if you can. Welcome to the first community engagement session that we're having over the next 3 weeks. It's great to start here in Chetwynd. It's great to be back here. As former Mayor Nichols knows that I've been here before. Would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Treaty 8 First Nations.
So to me, it's almost like kind of like a statement of claim, or maybe even an indoctrination type thing. Why were they always repeating it all the time? I've never seen that in Alberta, actually. I've only seen it here in BC. I was talking to someone else in another town, and they had mentioned how they can't protest any of this kind of thing that's going on, because if they did, they'd lose all of the contracts. They'd go bankrupt. So the Aboriginals have a tremendous amount of power here up in this area. And the bands are just small. I mean, and so you have 200 people in a band. You'll have the chief and maybe the council, which is, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 people. They exert a tremendous amount of power, and it's quite stunning to see actually. What happened was I come across a CTV article. It just kind of randomly popped up, and there was a First Nations chief. He was talking about how there was a meeting with the senators in regards to, I believe it was Bill 292 and 90 and 91, having to do with UNDRIP actually. And the senators didn't participate in that meeting, so it couldn't go forward. I don't know what the ramifications of that are, but that happened just a few days before the writ was dropped. So right now what's happening is all of this is kind of in limbo. But it seems to me we're very close to having UNDRIP implemented all across Canada. And as you heard from what I've read in there, that they have rights to all of the lands and resources of which they traditionally owned or used, the implications are tremendous. Something unrelated here is I've talked to a person who's an Aboriginal business owner, I mentioned to him that I was going to be running in the federal election here. And he says, Ron, I know way more than you of what's going on over here. And through the course of the conversation, basically he was stating that in 10 years, the Aboriginals are going to be taking Canada back. I didn't really question him on it. I mean, it was kind of out of the blue, and I thought, boy, that's quite a statement to make, you know. But here I can see it's entirely possible with UNDRIP. Another thing is that Jagmeet Singh and Elizabeth May both say that they're going to fully implement UNDRIP. But it's not just UNDRIP, it's also this issue of reconciliation. I haven't looked into that, but you know, just reading what UNDRIP is, I can just imagine what the reconciliation thing is. So what I want to know is, why is it that the members of Parliament haven't warned the people of what's going on? How come this is all being kind of sprung upon us like some big trap? For instance, I mean, the two members of Parliament here in this riding, we got Todd Doherty on one side, who's running up against Young, and then you have Bob Zimmer, who I'm competing against as well. And I'm wondering, how come these guys haven't really warned the people? I know that I read an article with Bob Zimmer. He was concerned that this temporary moratorium on the caribou, it's a 2-year moratorium, but he was concerned it's going to be permanent. Well, I guess that's what it's going to be. But then he goes and blames Catherine Meckenne. Well, the whole thing is that Catherine Meckenne is working with UNDRIP. It has to do with the UN. This is coming from the UN, this whole thing. Now, Bob Zimmer should know that. I mean, if I can find this stuff out in just a month's time on my own dime, then, you know, he's the official opposition. And you got, it's interesting here that Todd Doherty, he's actually racked up the biggest expenses out of any member of Parliament. And Bob Zimmer is number 4. These are supposed to be Conservatives. I think it was like $466,000 that Todd Doherty had racked up in 3/4 of a year. And I don't think that's including his wage. I think his wage is on top of that. And he racked up the highest flying expenses too as well. But and then Bob Zimmer, he's basically at around $412,000 for 3/4 of a year. Okay, so what are we talking here? We're talking about, I don't know, $600,000 a year for each of them. So, you know, times that by 4, that's $2.4 million each, let's, you know, as a rough number. So $4.85 million between the two of them. And have they, you know, given us any kind of warning of what's going on here? Have they stood up to this whole situation? One of the first things that happened with Scheer when he won the leadership race, or, you know, some people say it was stolen because there were 7,000 extra votes that night than members, and then they went to do a recount and the ballots were shredded. So you have that going on with Andrew Scheer, and the first thing he does pretty much is he has all of his members of Parliament vote in favour of the Paris Climate Accord. Andrew Scheer also wants to see Canada have a seat on the United Nations Security Council. They're all UN. So these members of Parliament, you know, basically they can't really say too much, it seems to me. So where are these guys? You know, what are they doing? How are they serving the people of these communities by allowing this stuff to happen without warning them? So to wrap up, basically, I mean, what we got going on here is we've got the United Nations with their UNDRIP, and they also got this reconciliation situation here with the Aboriginals. And huge swaths of land are going to be absolutely off limits to people. And there's no end in sight, really, because, I mean, first it's the caribou. What's it going to be next? The bear or the cougar? You know, some other thing? It's all very open-ended. And so these members of Parliament, I mean, they haven't really told us what's going on. They haven't given us a heads up. So what you really need to do is you need to get the People's Party of Canada in place so that we can actually go ahead and deal with it properly. Because here I am, I've been here for just over a month, and I've found out all this information, and I'm the one bringing this information to you. It's not these members of Parliament. United Nations, they want to be able to have their dictates on basically half of the world's land and water. If you go look at the United Nations biodiversity map of the United States, the rewilding of America, you're going to find that basically 3/4 of the United States is completely off limits to human traffic. And everyone's living funneled into compact cities. I knew this 20 years ago, but I just couldn't believe that they could actually pull something like that off. So is this what's happening here in Canada? Is this part of this rewilding of America? Because these towns are absolutely being hammered. Another issue that's come into play here is this whole thing with forestry. They're closing down mills left, right, and center, it seems like, and these towns are absolutely being hit hard. It has to do with the stumpage fees doubling, and it's just making it so it's unprofitable for these corporations to operate. Another thing that's going on with these small towns is that health services are being kind of channeled into the larger centers. So people are concerned that their small communities are just going to be basically, you know, dried up. All in all, it looks like it's a very precarious situation for the northern communities of Quebec and BC. I don't know about the other provinces, but I fully suspect that it's all across Canada. So what we need to do is we need to have a government in play like the People's Party of Canada that's not going to go along with all of these UN various different agendas. We've stated clearly that we're going to go out of the UN Paris Accord, we're going to go out of the UN Global Compact on Migration, and we'll have to analyze these other ones as well. So it's the People's Party of Canada is your only hope really right now in Northern BC and Northern Quebec, because all these other parties are going to fully implement UNDRIP, and it's going to continue to involve the caribou recovery and the big land allotment that's being done. And it's not a very good situation to be in. So Ron Vaillant, People's Party of Canada, put me into office here. We can get her done.